We're going to take a look at the definition of a function, or what is a function. Well, a function by definition is a function f from set A to set B is a rule. Okay, is a rule that assigns to each element of A in set A to a unique element f of A in B, called the image of A under F. So this might sound tricky at first, but I have a really good analogy that I would like to talk about. So imagine there's some set A with random elements that we do not care about, and there's some set B with some random element we do not care about. So what a function does is that, well, let's assume we have this big box right here, which we call f, which is the function, and it has an entrance and it has an exit, right? So what a function does is that it takes one of the element, so it takes an element from set A and then put it into this function, and then there's going to be some kind of output which we call f of A. So A inside, output is f of A. So that's what's happening, right? And this f of A is what we call the image of A under F. So F is like a machine that transforms some element from A that you put it in, and then it becomes an image of A under F, which we call f of A, right? So that's the definition of a function. It's like a machine that transforms some sort of input into an output. Like how to transform is another matter that we can discuss, but ultimately it's a thing that transforms some kind of input value correspond to input value to some output value. That's what the function is and what a function does. And then let's look at some example question. But before we do that, I want to introduce the notation that we use in mathematics about function. So remember how earlier we introduced there's a set A and there's a set B? We call the set A the domain of the function, which is all the possible input value you could ever put into the function. And then we call set B the codomain of the function, which is all the possible output value of this function. And then you often see people write notation. Look at our rule 2, that f, then A arrow B. So what does that mean? That means that f is a function with domain A and codomain B. That's what people mean. And the third rule is the set f of A, where A is an element of A. F of A, capitalized A, is called the range of F. F of A is always a subset of B. So what do you mean by that? Well, f of A, right? So if you take every element in A, in set A, and input it into our function right here, well, it's gonna produce a number of output correspond to the number of input that you put in, right? So all the possible value that A could ever be is the domain, and when you input it into the function, all the possible outcome of what you have put in is what we call a range of a function. And then I also mentioned that f of A, which is the range, is always a subset of B. Well, that makes sense because let's look at an example. It actually makes a lot of sense why the range is always a subset of the codomain, right? So our function says that, well, f is a function which has a domain of from -3 to 4, or with a codomain being -2 to 2. And the function or the rule that we are assigned to is sine x. So let's take a look at pi over 2. So we want to see what if our input value, let's draw this. This is our A, this is our B, and then this is our F. So let's draw the big box analogy again. So this is F, which is sine of x in this case. And then it has one entrance and one exit. Well, let's say we take pi over 2. Well, pi over 2 is roughly about 1.5 or something like that, which is in our domain, so that's fine. So we are curious about what happens if we take this value, input it, and see the output. Well, the sine of pi over 2 is equal to 1, which makes sense, right? And 1 is also in part of the codomain, so nothing's violating anything, right? So we know that the domain of this function right here, we said, is from -3 to 4, right? So what does that mean? That means that if we input value like 2 pi, it will be undefined, because domain is just supposed to be all the possible input value you could ever input. But values such as, let's say, 2 pi, right? Like if we input it, this is going to give us undefined. Well, why is that? Because 2 pi is essentially like 3.14 times 2, which is like 6, let's just say 6.2, right? 6.2, you can see that it's outside of our domain right here. So when you input something that's outside of the domain into our function, the result is gonna produce is supposed to be undefined, right? And our range of the function in this case will be -1 and +1, because as you learn, when you started to learn about like the cosine function or sine function, you know that it is always between -1 and +1, right? So the range of this function is -1 to 1, but our codomain is -2 to 2, which is like kind of doesn't serve any meaning, because the value of sine x can never exceed 1 or never get below 1, but we have a codomain of ranging from -2 to 2. So as you can see now, right, like the range is a subset of our codomain here. -1 to 1 is a subset of -2 to 2, right? So you can kind of get to see. And then what we do, to elaborate again, what do we mean by range? Range is like no matter what value you put in, like range is all the possible outcome of all your input value. And then in this case is for sine x is -1 and 1, because that's one of the property of sine x, is that it can never get beyond 1, it can never get below -1, right? So no matter what value you put in, that as long as it's inside of the domain, it's always gonna be, the output value is always gonna be somewhere between 1 and -1. So that's what's happening. And usually, like in the high school questions, like when you talk about functions such as sine x, the like they don't restrict the domain, because in this case we restrict the domain to be -3 to 4 and the codomain to be -2 to 2. But what people do is that people, in like at least in normal questions, they don't restrict it, which means that it's real number to real number. So what this means is that when you see this, it means that the domain is all the possible real number, and the codomain is all the possible real number. Well, as you can see, although the codomain is all the possible real number, the only like actual thing that can come out of sine x would just be between 1 and -1. But you could have but in this case you can just put into any x value and it will be fine, because in our previous case you cannot put in values such as 2 pi, because that's outside of domain. But if we set our domain to a all real number, you can put in any value, because values such as 2 pi or like any other like rational irrational value are all belongs to real number. But the all the eventually what actually comes out of this function will always be between 1 and -1. So to summarize what a function is, you can think of it as a machine that transforms some kind of value into another. Like but what exactly does it transform those value into? It depends on what the function is, of course. Well, if the case is like 2x or like sine x, like same like input value would produce different output value. So a function f, like ultimately, is a rule that assign each element and in a to a unique element f of a in b, which we call the image of a under f.